Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to start our new unit, which is factor markets and market failures. I guess I could show you the big fancy cover here, factor markets. It's really just two topics. There's a third topic that we like to do more in class, and it's inequality and the distribution of income and things. And we'll do a little bit of that, but kind of the core course is really on these two ideas of factor markets and market failures. So let's get started with factor markets. I thought I would share with you a quote from David Ricardo, who's kind of considered one of the founding figures of modern economics in the early 1800s, along with folks like Adam Smith and things. And David Ricardo wrote on the principles of political economy, which is the old name for economics. And he said, the produce of the earth, all that it is derived from its surface by the united application of labor, machinery, and capital, is divided among the three classes of the community, namely the proprietor of the land, the owner of the stock or capital necessary for its cultivation, and the laborers by whose industry it is cultivated. So, and if you have the person who owns the land, the person who owns the machine, and then the person who actually uses the machine and works the land. But in different stages of society, the proportions of the whole produce of the earth will be allotted to these classes under the names of rent, profit, and wages. And so in other words, he's saying what the profit that the landowner gets, we call rent, and the profit that the laborer gets is called wage, and the profit that the capitalist gets is called rent. And the allotment will be essentially different. To determine the laws which regulate this distribution is the principal problem in political economy or in economics, in fact. And so David Ricardo is laying out the cards here, saying that actually one of the central questions of economics is how do we distribute income, right, in terms of how much should the laborer get versus the landowner versus the person who owns the machine? And how do we allocate our time and resources among those three resources, right? How do we decide how many of one to employ or another to employ? And that's kind of an important question even today. So in that vein, right, in the spirit of Mr. Ricardo, we'll kind of take a look at factor markets. And so there are 4 extra practice modules that are associated with factor markets. Your book goes into a lot of detail about some things and more than I wish in others. And so, I'm on the fence about some of these modules, but I digress. So as a quick review, you have 3 factors of production, right? We learned this in the very first lessons of this class. You have land, labor, and capital. And we have entrepreneurship as kind of the 4th intangible, but we don't really trade it. And now we're going to add on to that and say that the price of land is called rent. And so we call it rent because of some complex background story, but it's essentially unearned benefit is kind of a way of saying that. And I know that that's kind of iffy saying, but trust me, we call it rent because there's an unearned benefit that's economically accruing to people who own land. And there's some explanation for that doesn't matter for our course. We abbreviate it R for rent. The price of labor is wage, and so we abbreviate that W. We don't usually say price of a worker because there's some implications there, and there's a long history in economics and capitalism of kind of intertwining with enslavement and exploitation, and there still is to some extent. And then capital, right? We also call the price of that rent, and we abbreviate that R. So if you see me use W and R, those just stand for price. There's 2 things, factor demand and factor supply, and we're kind of thinking about these. First is factor demand, and factor demand is really just the demand, right? The demand for the resource. That's kind of the way to think about it. So to make you write something down here, the resources demand, right? And so this is derived from the marginal revenue product. And that's a complex way of basically saying it's derived from the value of the thing that the resource generates. So I'll say that again. It's really saying if you aren't generating something of value, right, if you're the laborer or if you're the capital or the land, if it's not particularly valuable what you produce, then there's not going to be much demand for you. And so we can actually quantify the value of what you produce as the marginal product of what you produce, like how many units of the thing that you make times the price of the thing that you make, right? That's fairly straightforward. And so we'd say, like, if you multiply those together, that's the value of the stuff that you produce because it's how many units you produce times the price of the thing you produced. And so we call that MRP, marginal revenue product. Now, there are things that shift it, and they're basically listed right here, right? If the marginal product of each worker or each input changes, or if the price of the thing that they produce changes, that can affect the demand for that worker or that input or whatever, what have you. So that's what we have here is the demand for the output, right? Because if the demand for the output goes up, then the price of the output will go up. right? So that kind of makes sense. And then you would demand more of those workers. So if there's lots and lots of people who are clamoring for electric cars, for example, or AI, and you're one of the few workers who can build those and research those, the price of the final product, the electric car, is high. Well, then that means the demand for the person who can make it is high. An important note: price doesn't shift the curve. So the price of the input, like the wage that we pay to the worker, does not change the demand for the worker. It's really important, right? That's just the price of the worker. So we'd say the price of the land, the labor, and the capital does not shift the demand for the land, the labor, and the capital. It's the price of the thing that they're producing. Okay, and that's a really important observation. Factor supply is like the willingness of the worker to supply their labor, right? Or the willingness of the landowner to provide the land. In some sense, there's kind of a very inelastic supply curve for land because it's finite, right? You can't really create more. It's difficult to do so. But with labor, we find that it's typically upward sloping. And your book goes into some interesting explorations as to that trade-off between leisure and like money. But in short, right, it's derived from your willingness to work. There's some shifters of labor that are pretty commonly identified as like immigration. If you have more immigrants, there's more labor, so there's a greater supply. If there's an overall change in their leisure preferences, if people are like, work stinks, I really hate it, then that would decrease the supply of labor, that kind of thing. Cultural values, culture here being like, is it acceptable culturally for women to be in the workforce? And so that can change your labor supply curve, things like that. The wage doesn't change the supply curve, right? Just like we would say, if you have a supply curve, price, quantity, upward sloping supply curve, if the price goes up, all we do is we induce more workers in quantity to supply their labor. But we're not actually like creating a greater shift of the supply curve, if that makes sense. It's not like there are more workers. It's the pre-existing population of workers are now willing to supply more of their labor. But that's distinct from an actual increase in the supply of labor, which would be like more people who are actually willing to do the job. Okay, so now we're going to do a factor supply and demand graph. And I'm actually going to show you the graph for the market and the firm. And the firm, don't freak out. It's going to be okay. We'll get you there. So let's go ahead and get this one down. The very first one is the market. Oops, see how there, I already made the mistake. I put P and I should have put W. And so we'll say this is a labor market, So we'll put QL down here for quantity of labor. And then we'll have a downward sloping demand for labor and an upward sloping supply of labor, right? And if this is looking familiar, that's because it's a supply and demand graph. And so we have a quantity in the market, and we have an equilibrium wage that's getting paid. Now, in the firm's perspective, it's going to look a little different. So this is the quantity of labor for the firm, right? And this is the wage, and this is the firm. Now, from the firm's perspective, they have to just take the wage that the labor market sets. This is a perfectly competitive one. So from their perspective, right, they're just like, well, that's the wage. This is the wage that we have to pay. So we have to pay it to the first worker, we have to pay it to the second one, the third one, the fourth one, right? It doesn't really matter how many we hire. We pay the same wage to all of these workers. And we kind of consider them to be interchangeable in the sense that they're perfectly competitive. So one of the assumptions of this perfectly competitive labor market is that all these workers are exactly the same. And so we're going to pay them the same. If it helps, think of like a fast food restaurant. So we're going to call this MFC. And we're going to identify what that means later. But in short, it's the supply curve for the firm, of the laborers to the firm. So it's the supply of workers going to the company. What we would also find is that the firm has a downward sloping, boy, that's not even close to straight. Let's make the line bigger. It's terrible. Oh my gosh. A downward sloping thing called an MRP. Now, what is MRP? Well, it's the marginal revenue product. So realistically, this is just like the marginal product of each worker times the price of the product. And so we'd find that they're going to hire, we'll say they hire 2 workers. And that's kind of what the firm ends up looking like. So that's how they determine how many they're going to hire. We're going to explore that in a little bit more detail later. Now, the last part of this is how many of 2 different inputs to employ. And so actually we haven't talked about how many of 1 to employ yet, but it's kind of hinting at it right up here. But this is like, what if you had differing combinations of labor, like the L, and different combinations of capital? It's K instead of C, which we'll talk about later why that is next semester. So you could have like maybe 2 workers and 4 hammers, or you could have like 5 workers and 1 hammer, or whatever combination, right? And the question is like, what's the optimal combination of inputs that you would want to hire? So we just basically, we do the same thing that we did when we looked at optimal consumption of like, how many, chocolate bars and cups of coffee should we consume? Well, for that, we looked at like, what was the additional benefit, marginal utility, divided by the price of the good. And we found where they were equal, and then that's where how many they should consume, as long as you use the whole budget. From a firm's perspective, their marginal benefit is how many products they produce divided by the price that they pay for the input. So that's the marginal product divided by the rent has to equal the marginal product divided by the wage, or whatever the other thing is. If it's rent and rent, like if you're dealing with labor and capital, it would be wage and rent. If it's land and capital, then it's rent and rent. But you just look for where the 2 numbers are equal. So let's take a look. This is the total product of capital. Of like 1 capital, you get 3, 2, you get 12, 3, you get 30, 4, you get 57, and likewise total product of the units of product from each worker, or from the total of the workers. So if you had 1 worker, you'd get 2. If you had 2 workers, you'd get 8. 3, you'd get 18, and so forth. So all we have to do now is calculate the marginal product of labor, and that's the change, right? And if you had 0 units of capital, then you would have 0 total product. So the change is 3. Now the change is 9, 18, 27, oh boy, 15. Is that right? I hope so. 15. Oh, I did it right below me, and I should, duh. And then 3. And then over here, it's the same idea. The change is 2 because we started at 0. 6, 10, 12, 10, and 2. And now we're going to divide by the price of the thing, right? So the price of the worker and the price of the capital. And it tells us here the workers are $2 and the rent is $3 for each unit. So 3 divided by 3 is 1. 9 divided by 3 is 3. 18 divided by 3 is 6. 27 divided by 3 is 9. 15 divided by 3 is 5. 3 divided by 3 is 1. One thing that students often make the mistake of is they'll like do some kind of weird other division here. It's just whatever that R value is. It's the rent, so it's $3. For this one, we're just dividing by the wage that we pay the worker. So it's 1, 3, 5, 6, 5, 1. And we take our 2 fingers out, just like we did in the marginal utility per dollar thing, and we look for where are they paired. Well, they're paired at 1. But that's probably not going to be our solution. But we can check it if you want to. One capital is going to be $3, and 1 worker is 2, so that's 5. Our budget is 17, so it's clearly not that one. 3. Let's test 3. 3 would be 2 units of capital. That's $4, and then 2 units of workers is it's 6 and then 4, so that's $10. We still have to go to the next one. 6. So let's test this 6 is here, and I bet it's this one. 6 is 3 units of capital, and that's times $3 equals 9. So this is like how much we'd have to spend to employ them. It would be 9, and then 6 here. That's 4 workers times 2 is $8, and 8 plus 9 is 17. So that's how many we should employ. 3 and 4. And that is the most total product. Like if we were to actually sum up all the combinations where we use all $17, that's the most total product would be 60. You can't get a better combination than that, and still use your entire budget. All right, so in the next video, we're going to come back and actually look at like how many of one input to employ, and it's basically from this graph. But hopefully this helped you. I'll see you next time.